This thing is my new favorite physics toy. Over the last few months, I've spent a lot of hours in the garage allegedly working on this contraption, but a significant fraction of that time was me just sitting here watching the patterns that this thing was making. It's hypnotic. It's like better than a lava lamp. This machine mixes together ink and water at one end of this tube, and then slowly allows them to percolate across and, do their turbulent thing and then do their laminar thing, and then eventually get sucked back into this pipe where they go through a pump in this system through a filter that re-separates the ink from the water so that they can be re-injected. I would say it's very Sisyphean, where you're just doing all of this work and expending all of this effort to re-separate the ink and water before mixing them again. But at least Sisyphus, when he was pushing that rock up the hill only to have it fall back down every day, was immortal. And unfortunately, this system probably isn't. I've already destroyed one filter, and I'm expecting that this one won't last very long either. Turns out that filters that are intended for drinking water don't really enjoy having pure ink fed into them. I can't imagine why. In addition to, 1, being really messy, and 2, looking really cool, this machine has a startling amount of physics buried inside. So let's get started. Water is clear, which is pretty boring. Even when water is moving, you can't actually see what's going on. But this is what ink looks like when you drop it into water. The ink does 2 important things here. First, the impact of the droplet agitates the water, causing some local turbulence and motion. And second, the ink, being black and opaque, spreads out to provide a visual cue for this motion. When there's a combination of ink and water together, we can see where the water is moving. So for a first bit of physics, I'd have to go with opacity. But that's kind of boring. Of course, if you have a light, it's going to pass through the water but not pass through the ink. That's kind of why people make ink. So second, and more interesting, I'm going to go with fluid dynamics. Look at the ink at the start of this tube. It's all messy and there's stuff moving around in all different directions. But now look at the ink at the far end of this tube. It's so smooth, being pulled slowly and evenly into the output pipe. Why is this? Well, it comes down to shear forces, the speed of the water, and turbulent versus laminar flow. If you want to get mathy, it comes down to the Reynolds number, but we're not going to be doing very much math today. Of course, now that I said we're not going to do any math, I'm going to reel off some numbers. Here at the start, the ink is entering the tube through this 1.2 millimeter diameter hole into a 46 millimeter diameter tube. This ink is also moving a lot faster than the surrounding water. This creates a significant shear between 2 streams of fluid. And when this condition gets too extreme, the boundary breaks down into tiny turbulent vortices. If I decrease the flow velocity, we see this effect mostly goes away because the shear isn't strong enough. But if I massively increase the flow velocity, we see the shear is way too much. Oodles of tiny vortices mix the ink away into an opaque cloud before we have a chance to enjoy the patterns. By controlling this flow, I'm creating a stream of liquid that's barely turbulent enough to look cool, but not turbulent enough to mix too quickly. Similarly, but on a much slower scale, I'm injecting clear water through this 10 millimeter hole. This is much slower, but still causes a lot of overall circulation because there isn't another significant source of liquid in the tube. The water on the top, where there isn't an input, ends up going vaguely backwards, while the water on the bottom goes vaguely forwards. If I injected this clear water really slowly, it would probably go like this and form a laminar flow pattern. But I'm injecting the water much faster, causing the flow to become messy, turbulent, and critically, for the art of this machine, unpredictable. And the chaotic, unpredictable nature of turbulence is what makes this fun to watch. Turbulence randomizes the flow locally, and then it sort of chunks up and slows down, and we get these really complex patterns that are really slowly evolving and beautiful as they move through the pipe. So how does this turn into this? At the far end of the pipe, there's almost no circulation. Everything just kind of scooches slowly into the outlet. I'm injecting water at a rate of about 4 milliliters per minute right now, and in a 46 millimeter diameter pipe, that equates to only 2.5 millimeters per second. That's the average speed of the water in this tube, and it's really slow. But over here, we had water moving at multiple centimeters per second, maybe more if you count cranking the inkjet. But this high velocity water is next to water that's hardly moving, or sometimes actually moving backwards. So on average, the speed is still only about 2.5 millimeters per second. The fact that within this region we have multiple streams of water with massively different speeds is why it becomes turbulent. If I turn off the pump, we see that fluid friction relatively quickly halts the circulation, and we're left with static water and ink. When the pump is running, this same process happens, but since the entire mass of water is slowly scooting from left to right at 2.5 millimeters per second, looking at water on the right is like looking at older water. It all gets turbulent and then starts slowing down. And the farther to the right it has moved, the more time friction has had to do its thing. By the time this mass of water gets to the end of the pipe, it's pretty much static, and any further mixing between ink and water is diffusion. There's actually one more cool phenomenon that shapes the pattern of ink in this tube, and that's drag on the walls of the tube. If you look over here where the flow is nice and laminar and constant, whatever, it actually looks like it's bowing forward a little bit. And that's not an illusion, that's actually happening. When a liquid flows parallel to a surface, like the side wall of a clear plastic pipe, there's a drag force that slows it down. In this case, the liquid in the center of the pipe is farthest from a surface and experiences the least drag. One fun result from this is that the effective conductivity of water flowing down a pipe actually scales with the square of the area of the pipe. If I had a separate pipe with twice the cross-sectional area, it would actually be about 4 times easier to push water through this pipe than this pipe, because so much of this area is far away from the walls. I admit I'm really backwards, so I actually imagine water flowing through pipes as if they were circuits and electrons flowing through wires. And this bit always sort of weirds me out, because if you've got a wire with twice the cross-sectional area, it's going to have half the resistance, because the edges of the wire don't really mean anything in almost all cases. I know people are going to comment about skin effect, but it really normally doesn't matter. But all of that is a topic for another video. This slow-moving water is a nearly laminar flow, and that's actually really important for the machine, because as the ink and water mix more and more, we need to get them away from the input so we can separate them again. The place where we inject the ink paradoxically also has some of the cleanest water. It just also literally has the dirtiest water. But at the end, everything is closer to the same color. There actually isn't any clean water at the far end of the pipe. If we turn off the flow and let this process continue for a while, we see that the ink and water slowly diffuse together, turning everything into a sort of uniform murky brown color. The mixing you can see, the swirling and thinning of pockets of black ink and clear water, is called convection, where there's macroscopic motion of all these different fluids moving things and mixing back and forth. But the slow fade as the ink and water intermingle at a molecular level and just slowly dilute each other is called diffusion. And diffusion is a completely random, like, stochastic process, where convection is something that we can control. Convection, the macroscale mixing, is a lot faster than diffusion, the molecular scale mixing, but they are both happening in this tube. Editing Brian here. I am very tired. I have gone very deep down a rabbit hole of trying to quantify how laminar these flows actually are by, plotting vectors of the motion on the image, and I've been having an awful time of it, and I just had a breakthrough. I've been getting graphs that look like that. And now I'm getting graphs that look like that. One of the distinguishing characteristics of turbulent flow is that the fluid in a particular location doesn't have a constant velocity. My software here is tracking the motion of the ink at a few different locations, and we can clearly see the flow directions are changing over time. At this point, the flow started generally up, but is now pointing sort of backwards. And at this point, that's directly in the water stream, the flow direction is all over the place. I'm not even integrating over a small enough area to capture really how variable this is. Compare that with the other end of the pipe. None of these flows are changing. They all just point straight forwards. Even as the liquid gets to the end of the tube and the flow constricts into the output pipe, the streamlines are smooth. There are no vortices, no oscillation. The fluid just reaches the end of the tube, predictably changes direction, and scooches into the output. This is laminar flow. So how did this project come to be? Well, I'm sure that everybody watching at some point in their life has watched two liquids mix with a little bit of turbulence in there and gone, wow, that's really cool looking. Here's an example from the kitchen, mixing tea into slightly turbulent hot water. Of course, you want your tea to be uniform, which means that eventually they have to diffuse together and mix at a molecular level. But at the beginning, you can see this sort of turbulent convective mixing. And I think it does still look really cool. The most extreme form of this is an opaque black liquid in a clear liquid, and that's where I started my search. I wanted to create a device that sort of artistically mixed liquids to leverage this weird convection effect, but I wanted it to be a closed system. I didn't want it to be able to run out of either material, which meant that the liquids that we're mixing needed to be somehow separable. My first instinct was to use something like this ink, except with a really big particle size, so that I could filter it mechanically, or just let it settle out. Or if the particles were big enough, I could have hidden a settling pond inside of this box, and just with gravity let everything slowly fall to the bottom, and then I would have separated the ink and water. I also spent some time researching ferrofluids, thinking that I could have, a pipe with a magnet that I could switch on and off, and then another pipe that would draw out of the magneted area to try to separate some stream of oil in a ferrofluid. For a few different reasons, I decided not to go that route. What I ended up selecting was India ink, which is probably one of the worst choices I could have made. India ink is a mixture of water, shellac, and soot. And soot basically consists of ridiculously tiny carbon particles that are only tens or hundreds of nanometers across. Unless I went with something that actually dissolved ionically, it was polar like sodium chloride salt, I basically couldn't have picked anything harder to remove from water. That said, I'm using the ultimate filter, a reverse osmosis membrane, and this is the cartridge with the membrane that I already killed. If you read the product listing for this, it says that the pores will filter things down to 1 angstrom, which is absurd if you think about it. Like, absolutely absurd. This is what a water molecule looks like, and to scale, this is how big a typical reverse osmosis pore might be. And then this is a 50 nanometer carbon particle from the ink. So think about this for a minute. You need to make a hole in a solid thing that's only this big across. But that thing has to be made out of atoms because it's a thing, which are about this big across. What a ridiculous problem. The trick here is to make a polymer out of big molecules that can't stick together closely. They're like puzzle pieces that don't fill space very well. In cardboard, you could imagine something like this, but in molecules, the pieces look something like this, a little more complicated. But they're basically just these benzene rings with chunks on them that only attach to other chunks on specific rings. That means that when they react, they will always leave really, really tiny spaces in between. I'm going to talk a lot, really a lot, about the physics of osmosis in the next video. But for now, just know that these reverse osmosis filters are incredible. They're almost impossible to make, and they have pores that are so tiny that individual water molecules will barely fit through them. Now it's time to take a look under the hood. Man, what a disaster. Oh, and I released a whole bunch of air. So if we take a look under the hood, we can see an absolute rat's nest of tubing, some of which is necessary, and some of which is just here so I can purge air bubbles out of the system a little bit easier. Of course, you can see that I have not finished purging all of the air bubbles out of this system. That thing is the reverse osmosis membrane, this is a water pump, and this is the pressure gauge in between them. I'm running the membrane a bit higher than the spec, and at over 100 psi, this is not something to play with. Thankfully, since water is only barely compressible, water is compressible, but barely, a rupture isn't catastrophic. But any tiny air bubbles in the system that will expand during a depressurization event will cause a lot of water to spurt if I open the system under any pressure. The circuit looks like this. The water and ink mixture enter the pump, where they are pressurized in the RO chamber. A little water is squeezed out of the ink and goes through the membrane, and this gets pumped into the tube as the clear water input. As we pump more ink-water mixture into the filter, but only water leaves, the liquid that does not make it through the filter gets progressively inkier and inkier. If we add a second hose out of the high-pressure chamber for stuff that didn't make it through the filter, that's going to be our highly concentrated ink. Now there's a problem, because we have over 100 psi ink in here and very low pressure clear water output. That means we need to slow down the ink with a few resistors and a variable valve. This gives us complete control of the water and ink flowing through the system. The combination gets pumped into the filter, the clear water and ink come out of separate outputs, and then get shoved back into the tube. This is the Sisyphean part. We are expending a lot of energy to separate the ink from the water, then immediately remixing it just because it looks cool. There's something really satisfying about a closed system like that. I originally wanted this to be something that I could leave running like all the time, you know, set up on the wall in the living room or something. I even tried to buy a quiet pump. It turned out to be quite a loud pump for that reason. But unfortunately, I did end up clogging one of the filters. And I guess that gives me reason to fear that they would keep clogging. I'm not sure exactly why, but after some number of hours of runtime, no matter how much pressure I applied, I couldn't get water to pass through the membrane. Changing this out required an awful lot of mess. And then I actually had to refilter all of my used water and ink because I'd added a lot of water during the maintenance process. In this bucket was a few hundred milliliters of ink, but multiple gallons of water. I actually added another output to this filtration circuit so that I could use the pump and filter to reconcentrate the ink I wasn't using so that it wouldn't go to waste. And now in the cabinet I have some mildly diluted India ink in jars for the next time I have a problem. It's not hoarding, it's planning ahead. The actual method for injecting ink for maximum cool lookingness went through a lot of iteration. And while I think there are a few changes I might make to this, physically replacing the end caps would be a nightmare. So I haven't done it quite yet, but I might before I film the B-reel. So you in the future might already know if I decided to do that or not. The first experiments were just a clear flat plate for the water and ink. At this point I really just wanted to make sure that the filter and pump were going to be able to separate the water and ink successfully, which they did. It was very cool, and this stage was still very fun. I moved on to experiments with a variety of diameters of clear tube. I learned that backlighting was necessary for the effect that I was going for, and then I debated a vertical up, vertical down, or horizontal flow in the tube. The vertical down tube was actually really cool because I could put a spiral into the water stream, and the ink, having a higher density of water, would sink to the bottom reasonably fast. This made really cool patterns, but I really wanted to see the flow turn laminar at the end of the tube. And that can't happen if the ink is just sinking, or at least it can't over like a 16-inch long tube. You'd need something that was significantly taller. Maybe someday that'll happen and I'll make like a building-sized one of these, but for now, sideways was the answer. At this point, I replaced the duct tape with actual 3D printed end caps. The output is nice and simple. It's just, you know, a hole. But the input was an absolute mess of internal complexity. Having CAD like eat a few days of your life so that you can draw, print, and iterate on something so absurd looking is really relaxing sometimes. 10 out of 10 would recommend. I can only imagine this is what it feels like to design a rocket engine with some internal plumbing that could never be made by any conventional method. The caps are held in the tube with some very tight fitting O-rings. Oh, how did the first one go in? And now the plastic leaks.
I can't believe it's leaking through the plastic.
No, not the O-ring seal. Not the O-ring seal to the hose. Not the 3D printed NPT thread that replaced the O-ring seal to the hose. The plastic itself. So I ditched PLA, decided to print the end caps out of PETG, boosted the temperature, added a whole bunch of extra perimeters, and printed the whole thing at 105%, so it was really, really squishy. This made the prints globby and sort of less precise than I'd liked, but they hold water. Those printed parts sit on this plywood top that I designed in CAD and laser cut. The lighting is kind of included here. It's just a plywood box full of LED strip lights with a diffuser that makes it nice and even. I didn't realize at first just how weird it would be to look through a circular tube. The magnification on this is crazy. In order to increase the contrast for the viewer, I actually cut out a couple shrouds that only let a little bit of this light through, and the slots of light are much smaller than the tube itself. I might even have been able to get away with a single LED strip behind the tube that was just positioned properly. Because refraction spreads out and magnifies the inside, that's really all you need. If you get too far outside the viewing angle, you can actually start to see a magnified version of the shroud, which itself is kind of cool, although very much not what I was going for. So I finally bought a welder. That means I'm legally obligated to make as many things for as many videos as possible out of mild steel. This was day 1 of me with a welder, and that box over there was day 2. The structure of this box is steel angle, which is really fun and really unnecessarily beefy for what it needs to do. Just don't look too closely at the welds. Some look nice, not bad at all, But others, where I had large gaps to fill, no backing gas, was working at weird angles, and had almost no idea what I was doing, looked terrible. So I'm telling myself that the ground down sanded finish is an artistic choice. Don't measure the diagonals on the ends of the box. Just don't do it. It's illegal. All of this comes together into an overly scientific art piece that I love. I'll post a couple videos on the second channel that are just of the ink mixing at probably slow motion and regular. I might make that 2 videos. If anybody wants to, just watch uncut footage of something that is as hypnotic as a lava lamp, but maybe even better. Now, the astute viewer may have noticed that this thing has entropy of mixing written on the front, and I haven't talked about that at all yet. That's going to be the topic of the next video, along with flipping a lot of coins and analyzing the motion of some randomly bouncing steel balls. Entropy is a very strange concept, and it's really founded on a basis of statistics and probability, which means that I'm going to be leaning a little more than normal, not too much, but a little more than normal on math in the next video. If you're looking to brush up on your stats and probability knowledge before that video comes out, today's sponsor, Brilliant.org, has you covered. Brilliant also has loads of other courses on physics, programming, math, data analysis, AI, the list goes on. I was playing through a few of their statistics courses last weekend, and I'd recommend starting with the aptly named Introduction to Probability. It takes you down this great path of examples about soccer matches, and it feels like you're just, answering questions about games, but you're actually learning the core of probability theory, which turns out to be critical to the concept of entropy. Brilliant's teaching style with continuous feedback and interactive animations is a fantastic way to learn. You can get knowledge by reading a textbook, but you can really gain intuition for a topic when given the opportunity to interact with a demo. Fiddle with something and watch it change. And that interactivity is what Brilliant is all about. Honestly, I wish I'd been taught a lot of high school in this format. So if you want to try everything Brilliant has to offer free for a full 30 days, check out the link in the description or go to brilliant.org/alphaphoenix. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring this video, thanks to you for watching this video, and I'll see you next time to talk about entropy and osmosis, and reverse osmosis.